Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I remember it was sometime around mid-1987, and I was in Hickory, Kentucky, trying to push myself further into the backwoods of a national park not too far from town. I'd always been the kind of guy who preferred sleeping out in a tent rather than under a solid roof. After serving in the military, I got used to the roughness of it all. Long marches, quick camps, that feeling of being exposed to whatever nature decided to throw at you. I guess that's why I chose that place. I was drawn there by rumors and old legends. People talked about strange, cat-like creatures that supposedly roamed deep in those woods. Not mountain lions, not bobcats, but something else, something nobody ever had concrete proof of. It sounded ridiculous, but I've always been a sucker for that sort of thing. I went prepared. I had my maps, my old canteen, some gear to last me a few days, my knife, my small tent, and a battery-powered tape recorder that I'd gotten specifically to capture any weird sounds. I didn't tell many people where I was going or what I was looking for because I knew they'd laugh. The place was known for odd sightings, but nothing was ever confirmed. Just the kind of stories that old folks would tell near a campfire. Still, it was enough to get me in there, wandering off the main trails and into areas most people didn't bother exploring. It was late afternoon when I started to notice the forest getting quiet in a strange way. Normally, you'd hear birds, some distant rustling, just the regular soundtrack of being outdoors. But it's like the place started to hold its breath as I pushed deeper in. The undergrowth got thicker, and the ground felt soggy in certain spots, like I was moving through a swamp rather than a forest. I remember the smell of wet leaves and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't decay exactly, but it had this heavy, moist smell, like damp fur or a wild animal's den. I found some tracks that afternoon, footprints that looked like big cat prints, bigger than any I'd seen before, and I've tracked cougars out west. These were oddly spaced and pressed deep into the mud, as if something heavy had passed through. I took note of the time and the location, roughly marked on my map, and I tried to keep my excitement in check. I knew I should be cautious. Whatever made those tracks probably wouldn't welcome me with open arms. By the time night fell, I'd set up a small camp. Nothing fancy, just my tent and a small fire. I had my flashlight and my tape recorder ready. I didn't cook much, just some dried rations, because I didn't want strong food smells floating around. The forest was so dark that night, so dark that the beam of my flashlight looked like it was slicing through black fog. After a while, I decided to turn the flashlight off. I wanted to let my eyes adjust, to see if I could catch movement in the darkness. It was risky, I know, but I figured I'd sense if something big came too close. That's when I heard it. It started as a low whistle, almost like a person trying to quietly signal someone else. But then it turned into this strange, rhythmic sound, like a kind of humming whistle. I'd never heard anything like it in my life. I froze, not sure if I should turn the flashlight back on. The sound was coming from my left, maybe 50 feet away, behind a cluster of dense bushes. I reached slowly for my tape recorder and clicked it on, pointing it in that direction. The whistling rose and fell in a pattern I couldn't place. It wasn't a bird. I know what birds sound like at night. This was different, almost deliberate, like a chant. I stayed quiet, barely breathing. Something moved in the bushes. I heard branches crack, not small twigs, but thick branches snapping as if under heavy weight. I didn't dare move the flashlight just yet. Then I saw it, or at least I think I did. A dark silhouette shifted against an even darker background. It was low to the ground but huge, like a large cat. But there was something about its outline that didn't match the shape of any cat I knew. The head seemed elongated, and the shoulders were higher than they should have been. And the way it moved, smooth yet heavy, cautious but not fearful. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I swear I heard something else too, a slithering noise off to my right, like a large snake sliding over damp leaves. But that made no sense. There aren't snakes that big around here, at least none that would make such a loud, dragging sound. I started to think I might be losing it. Maybe my nerves were getting the best of me. Still, I kept that tape recorder running, hoping it would capture something, anything, that I could analyze later. The whistling sound stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was worse. My mouth went dry, and I could feel sweat trickling down the back of my neck. I slowly lifted my flashlight and aimed it low, trying not to startle whatever was there. I caught a glimpse of movement, a tail. It disappeared behind the bushes. Then everything was quiet again, except for my own breathing. For what felt like an hour, I just sat there, motionless, straining my ears. Eventually, I managed to doze off for a bit, though I can't say how long. I woke up just before dawn, with this uneasy feeling that I'd never really been alone that night. The forest was still quiet, but the normal sounds had begun to return. Birds chirping in the distance, a soft breeze rustling leaves. It was almost like the place was going back to its regular routine now that the night's intruder had left. I stepped out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and went to where I thought I'd seen the silhouette. I found broken branches about shoulder height, which would be unusual for a normal big cat. There were scratch marks on a tree trunk, deep and wide, not the kind you'd expect from a known species. And then, on a patch of muddy ground, I found more tracks, huge paw prints that seemed to have claws that curved in an odd way. I tried to take a photo with my old camera, but the light wasn't great yet, and I'm not sure the pictures would show much. I felt this mix of excitement and dread. I knew I had found something, or at least gotten close to something that wasn't supposed to exist around here. But at the same time, I didn't know if I ever wanted to meet it face to face. The fear that had clenched my stomach the night before was still there, and every time I thought about that low whistle, I got goosebumps. I packed up my camp quietly and decided to head back. As I made my way out, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing. The forest seemed perfectly normal again. I remember stepping over logs, pushing through thick ferns, and feeling like every snapping twig under my boot might trigger something to come rushing out at me. Nothing did, though. By the time I reached more familiar trails, it was like the whole experience had never happened. I went home and listened to the tape recording. It mostly picked up my own breathing and the rustle of leaves, but if I turned the volume up, there was a faint sound in the background. It could be that whistling, or it could just be the wind. I can't say for sure. The camera film didn't show much either, just dark shapes and blurry outlines of vegetation. If I showed anyone, they'd say it was just poor photography or shadows. I never did get a proper explanation. I've been back out in the woods since then, though not to that exact spot. I've never heard anything like that whistle again, never found tracks like that, never seen any creature that matched what I glimpsed. I've told a few close friends about it, and they either think I'm messing with them or that I just got spooked by a cougar or something normal. But I know what I saw, or at least what I think I saw. I still get chills remembering that night. It just happened, and then stopped, as if whatever was out there decided it had shown me enough, and then vanished back into the forest. To this day, I have no clue what it was. Maybe it was just some freak occurrence, maybe some strange hybrid cat that escaped from somewhere, or maybe something that science hasn't documented yet. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm just putting it out there because even now, decades later, I can't shake the feeling that there's something in those woods that we're not supposed to find. It's out there, silently watching, and the worst part is, I know I'll never get any real proof. It was just that one night, and then it was gone, and I still have no explanation for it. Story 2. I still remember that day in late summer of '92 like it happened yesterday. I was a few months into my new job as a ranger near Gardner, Montana, just inside Yellowstone. At that point, I'd already heard strange noises in the woods, felt that unsettling quiet that didn't belong there, and even caught hints of odd smells I couldn't pinpoint. But I always tried to brush it off. Maybe just my nerves as the new guy. Maybe just fatigue. That day, though, something happened that I still can't fully explain. I set out earlier than usual. The morning light was soft, kind of hazy, and the air was cool enough that I pulled my jacket tight. I was supposed to verify a report of smoke in a remote spot off one of the less-traveled trails. Nothing alarming. Sometimes campers lost track of where they were allowed to set fires, or maybe someone had torched some brush and left. My supervisor told me to check it out and radio back. The first hour or so was uneventful. I followed a faint path that wound through clusters of pine and aspen, crunching over dried needles, occasionally scaring off a squirrel or two. It was quiet, but not dead quiet. I could still hear a distant woodpecker and the trickle of a small stream. That felt normal. At some point, though, as the day wore on and I went deeper, the atmosphere changed. I can't say exactly when, but at some moment the woods went completely silent. It was like someone hit a mute button. No birds, no insects, no breeze rustling the leaves, just a total, heavy stillness. I stopped walking because my own footsteps sounded deafening. For a second, I just stood there, ears straining, expecting something to happen. Nothing did, so I kept going. But now, every step felt wrong, like I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. After a few more minutes, I caught a whiff of something off. It wasn't the usual smell of decaying leaves or damp earth. It was, I don't know, stale and chemical, but faint enough that I couldn't pinpoint it. I scanned the forest floor for signs of a camp or someone's leftover trash, but saw nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no scorched patches. Just normal forest debris. Still, that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I pushed forward, telling myself I had a job to do. I reached a slight clearing, just a patch of grass and wildflowers with a decent view of the surrounding pines. I expected at least to see some smoke rising in the distance, but there was no smoke, no haze, nothing. As I stood there, I got this strong sense that I wasn't alone. It felt like something was watching from behind the trees, just outside my field of vision. I turned around quickly, hoping to catch a deer or maybe a curious fox. I saw nothing. But here's the thing. As I turned, I swear I heard a soft crunch right behind me, like a footstep that had just tried to mimic mine. I spun back. Nothing again. I told myself it could have been a twig snapping under its own weight. I kept telling myself these things because I didn't want to panic. Still, I was on edge now. My heart was racing, and I could feel that weird mix of heat and chills crawling up my spine. I decided to loop back toward a different trail and head for a known landmark, an old fallen log that I'd passed a few times. I figured if I got my bearings there, I'd at least feel more confident. But the forest seemed different. I'm not talking about anything magical or impossible. It just seemed like I'd walked into a different section of the park without realizing it. Trees looked older, the light felt dimmer, and there was this sense of emptiness that made no sense for midday. At some point, I tried to radio back to the station. The static was overwhelming. All I got was crackling and this weird popping sound that could have been interference or maybe something else. I tried calling out a few times, stating my location as best I could. Nothing. Just dead air. I wasn't in some remote canyon or a dead zone. I'd used the radio in similar spots before and it was fine. This time, it was like no one could hear me at all. As I kept walking, I started feeling disoriented. I know how to read a map, and I know how to track my position. But that day, nothing matched. The old landmarks were missing, or maybe I was missing them. The sun felt like it was stuck in a weird position. I remember checking my watch, and it seemed later than it should have been. It was like I'd lost an hour or two somewhere, and I couldn't figure out how. The worst moment was when I heard my name. Just a whisper. Not a scream, not someone calling for help. Just a quiet, gentle whisper of my first name drifting through the trees. I froze. My mouth went dry. I waited, listened. I whispered back, barely making a sound myself. No response. I walked a few steps in the direction I thought it came from, but the silence was so overwhelming that I felt like I was suffocating. There was no point in shouting. If someone was playing a prank, they were good at hiding. But this didn't feel like a prank. It felt deliberate and, I don't know, just wrong. I tried to calm myself by focusing on small, concrete details. The crack in the bark of a tree, the shape of a rock half buried in the moss, the pattern of pine needles on the ground. But these details were starting to feel meaningless. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was pressing in on me, watching. For a second, it even crossed my mind that maybe I'd inhaled some weird fungal spores or something that was making me hallucinate. But everything looked normal, just eerily, impossibly quiet. Eventually, I managed to find a familiar stretch of trail. The silence started to fade a bit, and I heard a distant gust of wind or maybe a bird call. Whatever was messing with my head seemed to ease off. As I stepped onto more recognizable terrain, I felt like I'd just escaped something I didn't fully understand. My radio crackled back to life with faint voices from the station, and I nearly jumped at the sound. I quickly reported back that I didn't find the smoke but might have gotten turned around. They didn't seem worried, just told me to return. When I got back to the ranger station, I checked my watch and then cross-checked with the station clock. Somehow I'd been out there a lot longer than it felt. Or maybe it felt longer than it actually was. I'm still not sure. The rest of the day passed normally enough, but I couldn't shake that memory. I told one co-worker that I didn't find any campers or smoke, just some weird quiet. He shrugged and said sometimes the park does that, goes silent for no reason. But the way he said it didn't sound reassuring, more like he was just brushing it off. I never got an explanation. I never saw any strange creature, never found footprints, never caught sight of a person messing with me. The forest just didn't act right that day. It felt alive in a way that I can't put into words, like it had noticed me noticing it and decided to push back somehow. After that day, I was more cautious. I avoided deep, isolated sections alone if I could. I kept my radio on and double-checked everything. All these years later, I still can't say what I encountered. If it was something natural that I just misunderstood, if it was my own mind playing tricks on me, or if there was something else out there in that forest clearing. I know I didn't imagine that silence, that smell, those impossible footsteps, and that voice, my name spoken out loud with no one around, still wakes me up sometimes. I never found out what caused that feeling of being watched, never learned what created that eerie quiet, and never got an answer about where those missing hours went. The forest went right back to normal the very next day, and no one else reported anything strange. It was as if it had just decided to mess with me once and then leave me hanging. I still think about it. I still don't have any explanation. Story 3. I remember it was sometime in the fall of 1985, here in Defiance, Ohio. I was working for the State Parks and Wildlife Division, just doing my usual late rounds in one of the nearby parks. To be honest, most of my shifts were pretty dull, checking trails, making sure signs were still standing, maybe shooing off the occasional raccoon sniffing around a trash bin. I never expected anything truly strange out there. The woods at night were quiet, peaceful even, just the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt and the distant hoot of an owl now and then. That night, though, something felt a bit off from the start. The sky was clear, and the moon was full enough that I could almost make out details without my flashlight. The air was still, and I remember thinking it was unusually silent. No insect hum, no rustling leaves, just dead quiet. I tried to shake it off as just a slow night. I was following this loop trail that curved through a thicker patch of forest. Everything was normal until I heard this low, rumbling sound. It wasn't loud, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It sounded like a growl, something deep in the throat, like a large animal warning me to keep my distance. I stopped and tried to place it. I knew the local wildlife, foxes, coyotes, maybe the occasional stray dog. But this sounded heavier, somehow more controlled. It wasn't the frantic noise a scared animal makes, and it didn't match any bark, grunt, or howl I'd ever heard. I stood there for a moment, holding my breath, listening. There was a small clearing up ahead, just a patch where some trees had fallen over the years. The moonlight filtered in pretty well there, so I decided to move closer, real slow, being careful not to make much noise. My heart was pounding, and I kept my flashlight off for now. Figured if it was something aggressive, shining a light right at it might just provoke it. As I got closer, I could see something large between the trees on the far edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it might be a big dog on its hind legs, maybe leaning against a trunk. But that didn't make any sense. Dogs don't stand like that. And this thing was tall. I'm not great at guessing heights at night, but it looked too large to be a normal wolf or coyote. It had a shape that reminded me of a wolf's silhouette, but stretched upward, standing almost like a person. Its shoulders looked broad, its head was set forward, and I could see eyes reflecting the moonlight, 2 points of light staring right at me. I froze. I didn't run, because I knew sudden movement could trigger a chase response, especially if this was some unknown predator. I just stood there, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, trying to convince myself that I was seeing things. Could it be a trick of the light? A stump, maybe, with strange moss and the moon playing tricks on my eyes. But then it moved. It tilted its head slightly, a small, curious movement, like it was sizing me up. In that moment, my mouth went completely dry. I remember feeling this intense urge to back away, but I was afraid any sudden motion would bring it closer. I tried to breathe quietly, keep my shoulders relaxed, pretend I wasn't terrified. My mind was racing. What the hell is this thing? Some big stray dog with a disease, a bear with mange standing on its back legs. But it didn't have the bulk of a bear, and its outline was lean, more like a wolf or a German shepherd, just freakishly tall and standing wrong. We stood there staring at each other for what felt like minutes. No sounds, no other movement, just me breathing fast, and this creature watching me. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't dare use it. I just relied on the moonlight. I could see its ears were pointed. Its legs looked bent in a way that wasn't human. I can't explain why, but I kept expecting it to charge. Instead, it just seemed curious. Maybe it was as confused by me as I was by it. Eventually, it started to back away. I'm not sure why. Maybe I didn't seem worth the trouble. Maybe it was just as freaked out. It stepped backward into the darker part of the forest, slipping between trees so quietly I barely heard a thing. One moment it was there, the next it was swallowed by the shadows. I stood there alone, feeling like I'd lost track of time. My heart was still hammering in my chest, and I was sweating despite the cool night air. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to turn on my flashlight and scan the area. Nothing. No tracks I could make out. No eyes shining back at me. Just the same old clearing, a few fallen logs, and the quiet rustle of leaves as a slight breeze finally picked up. I hurried back along the trail, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. I couldn't shake the feeling that it might be following me, but I never saw anything else. I got back to the small operations cabin we used as a base and locked the door behind me. I didn't know who to tell. I mean, how do you explain you've seen what looks like a giant wolf walking on two legs? People would think I was either drunk or hallucinating. I wasn't either. I was just a tired park worker who'd seen something that shouldn't exist. I spent the rest of the night trying to calm down, going over the details in my head, asking myself if I'd imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. It was too real, the way it moved, the way its eyes reflected the moonlight. Over the following weeks, I mentioned it quietly to a few locals I trusted. I expected laughter or concern, but instead I got these uneasy looks. Some told me they'd heard strange noises at night. Others said they'd seen something lurking around the outskirts of the park. No one had a good explanation. We all just knew something weird was out there. I've never been able to explain what I saw that night. I've tried convincing myself it was just a large wolf or a dog with an odd posture, but my gut still tells me otherwise. Something about the way it stood, the way it looked at me. It felt, I don't know, aware. Not just an animal acting on instinct. It was like it was evaluating me, deciding whether I was a threat or maybe just interesting to observe. Whatever it was, it didn't attack me, and I guess I'm grateful for that. But it left me with a lingering sense of unease. From that night on, I paid a lot more attention to the woods around Defiance. I listened closer to the sounds of the forest, and every so often I caught myself looking over my shoulder, worried I'd see those eyes again. But I never did. It was like it came and went, leaving me with a memory I can't quite shake off. I still think about it, all these years later, and I still don't have a decent explanation. It's just something that happened, something that changed the way I look at the night, the woods, and the creatures that might be out there watching when we least expect it. Story 4. I remember it was late in the summer of 1975 when I set out from Mossyrock to find that old site people kept whispering about, Barrow Springs. I'd heard stories around the local inns and coffee shops, little hints about a settlement that supposedly existed long before the town got established. Most folks just rolled their eyes, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'd spent days examining old maps, circling spots, and plotting a route through the national park nearby. If anything was left of that place, I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I started walking early in the morning, navigating with a battered compass and these faded old maps that didn't line up perfectly with the modern trails. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. It's hard to explain, but it was like the forest around me got heavier. The usual sounds, birds, wind rustling in the branches, seemed muffled, as if I had stepped into a bubble of silence. It felt unnatural. I've spent a lot of time outdoors, and I know what normal forest quiet feels like. This was different, like something was holding its breath. I remember sweating through my shirt as I climbed over mossy logs and wove between thick ferns, trying not to lose my bearings. Eventually I stumbled onto a small clearing. The grass was patchy, and the ground rose into a kind of odd mound. Kneeling down, I brushed aside dead leaves and found pieces of old pottery, small fragments of hand-molded ceramics, and a few tools that looked like they'd been chipped from stone. My pulse sped up. I mean, these weren't random rocks. They looked like authentic artifacts. I took a few notes and carefully wrapped one fragment in my handkerchief. It felt like I'd finally found some real evidence that people had lived here long ago. But I didn't feel excited the way I thought I would. I felt uneasy, like I was prying into something I wasn't supposed to see. I pressed on, moving past that mound and into denser vegetation. A few minutes later, I spotted something that made me stop in my tracks. The forest floor dipped slightly, and at its center there was a spring of water bubbling up from the earth, clear as glass and cool to the touch. I scooped a bit of water in my hand. It tasted clean, like mountain water, no odd smell. But there was something about that spring. It was too perfect, too still. The air around it felt charged somehow, like I'd walked into a place that was meant to be left alone. As I jotted down notes, the silence suddenly broke with a soft crack, the sound of a branch snapping. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was sharp enough to send a jolt through me. I looked up, and at first, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. There was a tall figure just beyond the spring, half concealed by the undergrowth. My brain tried to make sense of it. It looked like a human shape, but it was covered in this strange layer of leaves and vines, as if the forest itself had grown over its body. I swear I could see the outline of shoulders and a head, and two glowing eyes, reflecting whatever faint light was passing through the canopy. I didn't smell anything weird. I didn't hear heavy breathing. It just stood there, still, watching me. I felt my chest tighten. I wasn't sure if I was looking at a person dressed in some kind of camouflage, or an animal standing on its hind legs, or something else. I know how it sounds, but in that moment, it was just terrifying. Not because it charged at me or made any aggressive move, but because it felt wrong, like I had crossed into a place I didn't belong, and this thing was letting me know without a word. I remember my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to say something, but I didn't dare speak. I didn't even want to raise my voice. I just stood there, clutching my notebook, trying to keep my breathing quiet. The figure shifted slightly, and I noticed how unnaturally tall it was. Definitely taller than any person I'd met. Its posture was strange, too, rigid, yet alive. The leaves on its body weren't random. They were arranged in a pattern, almost like a garment draped over its limbs. I felt my scalp prickle with fear, but at the same time, I didn't sense hatred or immediate danger. Instead, it felt like a warning, like this figure was telling me to tread carefully. It didn't vanish right away. For what felt like minutes, we just locked eyes, or at least I think those were eyes. They gleamed faintly in the dim forest light, not glowing like an animal's would under a flashlight, but shimmering, as if catching the slightest bit of sun filtering down. My mind raced. Should I approach? Should I run? My legs felt weak. I wanted to record every detail, but my hands were shaking. I remember thinking that I had found the heart of whatever those old stories hinted at. The old settlers, the sacred spring. This could be the reason people only whispered about Barrow Springs. Maybe they'd seen this thing too and decided to keep quiet. My mouth was dry, my palms damp. I tried to swallow, but my throat seemed to close up. Then, as if bored or satisfied, the figure stepped backward. It moved without a sound. The leaves, the branches, it all seemed to shift in unison, blending back into the forest. Within seconds, it was gone. I stood there alone, feeling the breeze pick up again. The silence eased, and I heard a distant bird cry, which somehow reassured me that I wasn't dreaming. I stayed in that spot for a while, maybe an hour, just trying to pull myself together. Eventually I walked back, careful retracing my steps, half expecting that thing to appear again behind every tree. But it never did. By the time I reached the edge of the park and saw the farmland that stretched back toward Mossy Rock, I started to question if I'd imagined it all. Yet my notes, the ceramic fragments in my handkerchief, and the way my heart still pounded, told me something very real had happened out there. I never told anyone about the figure. I only mentioned the ceramics and the spring to a few other researchers, leaving out the part that would make me sound crazy. To this day, I still don't know what I encountered. I've thought about going back, but honestly, I'm too shaken. I didn't feel physically harmed, but the fear of what I can't explain is enough to keep me away. As time passed, whenever I'd glance over my notes, I'd get that same uneasy feeling in my gut. It's been years now, and I still don't have answers. That day just ended, and life went on like normal. But I can't shake the feeling that I stumbled into something ancient, something that has its own rules and purpose, something that doesn't want to be understood. I guess I'll never really know. It just happened, and then it was over, and I'm left with nothing but that unsettling memory. Story 5. I'm not sure why I feel the need to share this now after all these years, but it's been stuck in my head ever since it happened. Back in the summer of 2003, my girlfriend and I decided to camp near Ely, Nevada, in this national park area that people always said was great for getting away from it all. We were both looking for a quiet weekend, no crowds, just the two of us and nature. We were used to hiking and camping, so we didn't expect anything more than a peaceful escape under a starry sky. The first night was actually nice. The sky was unbelievably clear, and you could see what felt like every star in the universe. There was a gentle breeze, the soft trickle of some stream not too far off. It was exactly what we'd come for. The next morning, we woke up early and decided to explore one of the less-traveled trails. We had a printed map. We didn't rely too much on technology back then, and a ranger had mentioned a path that was quieter, kind of hidden, but supposedly led to a nice clearing with a great view. We started off feeling excited. The trail was narrow, with tall trees on either side, and thick brush that made it hard to see very far off the path. As we walked, maybe an hour in, I realized something odd. I didn't hear any birds, not a single one. That might not sound like a big deal, but it's weird when you're deep in nature. You expect some rustling, distant animal calls, something that tells you you're surrounded by wildlife. Instead, it was dead quiet. I mentioned it to my girlfriend, and she shrugged, trying not to look worried, but I could tell she felt it too. We kept going. Another hour passed, and still nothing. No squirrels, no rabbits darting around, no animal tracks. Just us and those trees. The quiet felt heavier, like there was some kind of pressure in the air. I started feeling a strange tension at the back of my neck, like someone was watching us. I know it sounds cliché, but that's what it felt like we were being observed, but I couldn't see anyone or anything. I tried to brush it off as paranoia and kept my eyes on the map, making sure we were going the right way. Eventually, we reached a slightly more open area, kind of a clearing. The air here felt thick, almost charged. I don't know how else to describe it, like when you sense a storm coming, but the sky was clear. The trees looked warped somehow. Not all of them, but enough that I noticed their trunks twisting in strange ways, roots exposed like bony fingers. My girlfriend tried to laugh it off as natural oddities, but I could tell she was as unsettled as I was. We both had that feeling you get when your gut is screaming at you that something is off. We decided it was time to head back. We didn't even spend that long at the clearing. It just felt wrong to linger there. So we turned around and started retracing our steps, or at least we thought we were. But the path didn't look the same. Fallen branches and logs seemed to appear where there weren't any before. The undergrowth looked thicker. We were sure we had come straight along the trail, but now we kept hitting dead ends or had to climb over weirdly placed logs. It was like the forest itself was shifting. I know that sounds insane, but I was there. I remember the frustration, the confusion. Time was passing faster than I expected, and the light began to change. It was getting late. The sun was starting to dip, and a cold panic settled in. We had plenty of daylight when we started back, so how were we suddenly racing against dusk? My girlfriend had a compass, and we tried to follow the direction back towards our campsite. But even with the compass, every direction felt wrong. The silence followed us the entire time. Then we heard something, a low, distant sound, kind of like a moan or a long exhale. It was too low-pitched to be the wind, and too irregular to be some natural settling of trees. We stood still, shining our small flashlight around. It was getting pretty dark under the canopy, trying to pinpoint the noise. But every time we thought we had its direction, it would stop, then start again from another direction, just soft enough that we couldn't be sure if it was an animal or something else. I whispered that we should just keep moving, try to ignore it, and find our camp. We walked faster, barely talking, listening for any sign of familiar territory. My skin was covered in goosebumps, and I felt this constant urge to turn around, expecting to catch a glimpse of something behind us. We did see movement a few times, shadows shifting between trees, not big animals but small, quick shapes. Each time we shone the flashlight, there was nothing there. No tracks, no eyes reflecting back at us. Just empty woods. My girlfriend started crying softly, trying not to panic, and I tried to stay calm, holding her hand, telling her we'd be fine. After what felt like hours, we finally recognized a landmark, a fallen tree near a small rock formation close to our camp. I've never felt so relieved. We pushed forward, and sure enough, there was our campsite, just as we left it. The tent was still zipped, our stuff untouched. It looked normal, safe even, but the air still felt heavy and wrong. Without even discussing it, we started packing up immediately. I didn't care that it was night. I'd rather drive back on dirt roads in darkness than spend another minute in that place. As we packed, I swear I heard that low moan one last time, closer than before. I froze, flashlight in hand, waiting for something, anything, to show itself. Nothing did, just silence again. My girlfriend hurried, throwing things into the trunk, checking over her shoulder every few seconds. We got in the car and started driving out, headlights cutting through the darkness. The road was rough and our nerves were shot, but we didn't say a word. I kept expecting something to run across the road or slam into our windshield, but it never happened. Eventually, the trees thinned, the dirt road joined a slightly bigger road, and we started seeing distant lights. That's when we both exhaled and spoke again, asking each other what the hell had happened back there. No matter how many times we've talked about it, we can't explain it. We had no proof, no weird photos, no injuries, nothing got stolen, just that intense, oppressive silence, that twisted landscape, and the feeling of being watched. Friends we told later just laughed, said we were tired, maybe we got turned around and freaked ourselves out. But I know what I felt. We both did. To this day, I think about how the forest seemed to change, how the path back was blocked in ways that didn't make sense, and that eerie sound that followed us. It's been over a decade, and I still get chills thinking about it. It started suddenly and ended just as abruptly when we left the area. I can't shake the feeling that something out there was aware of us and didn't want us there. I don't have a neat conclusion, no grand lesson to share. We made it out, and that's it. But I'll never forget that day, and I'll never feel the same way about quiet forests again. Story 6. I was part of a small group of friends who decided to spend a few days exploring the redwood forests near Quincy, California, back in 2018. We were all pretty into hiking and camping, so it felt natural to set up our tents in a clearing not too far off a known trail. The first night was honestly beautiful, just a normal camping trip. We had a small fire, talked quietly, and watched the moonlight filter through these insanely tall trees. The sound of a few distant owls and the gentle crackling of the fire put me at ease. It felt safe and familiar. But something shifted on the second day. I remember waking up early, stepping out of my tent, and feeling like the entire forest had changed overnight. It wasn't like the place got darker or anything dramatic like that, but it was quieter. Too quiet. The night before, I swear you could hear birds calling back and forth, small creatures rustling through the underbrush, even the distant hum of insects. That morning, it felt like the volume had been turned way down. The wind was still, and I noticed the birds sticking to the lower branches or not landing at all. It was like they were avoiding the treetops, which was strange, but I tried not to overthink it. Our plan for that day was to do a more serious hike into a section of the park we hadn't explored yet, where the sequoias were supposed to be massive and less visited. The walk started out fine. We were chatting quietly, taking photos, checking out odd patterns in the bark of the redwoods. But as we went deeper, we started noticing these bizarre marks on some of the trunks. They looked like deep scratches, maybe 4 or 5 lines running parallel, cutting right into the wood. Not something easily done by a human. They were high up too, higher than any of us could reach, even if we stood on each other's shoulders. It wasn't just scratches, though. Some looked almost like symbols, but not quite. More like random patterns that didn't make sense. I remember running my fingertips along one and feeling how deeply cut it was. It made me think of something with claws, something not small. We tried to guess what could have made those marks. A bear, maybe, but the patterns were odd. A mountain lion. But why so high and arranged like that? Our conversation got quieter as we moved on, and there was a weird tension in the air. I kept feeling like someone was watching us, even though I knew that didn't make any sense. The others must have felt it too, because we stopped chatting so much and just focused on walking. As the day went on, the atmosphere got heavier. Around late afternoon, just as the sky took on that orange tint, we heard something. It was far off at first, like a distant whistle or a quiet howl. It was this strange combination of a low growl and a short, sharp whistle. We all froze. At first, I assumed maybe it was just some weird bird I'd never heard before, or maybe wind through the trees. But there was a rhythm to it, like it was calling out in intervals. We stood there for a moment, silently checking each other's reactions. I think we all knew we shouldn't go towards it, but we were a group of curious idiots who had come all this way expecting adventure. Without really saying it out loud, we followed the sound. The sound led us off the main trail, through dense undergrowth. We climbed over damp rocks covered in moss, slipped on patches of loose soil, and squeezed between thick trunks. Eventually, we came to this small clearing I'll never forget. The space was maybe 20 feet across, ringed by massive sequoias and covered in a carpet of fallen leaves. But the leaves were swirling slightly, as if caught in a gentle breeze that I couldn't feel on my skin. It looked like tiny whirlwinds lifting the leaves just inches off the ground. In the center of that clearing, partially hidden behind a fallen sequoia, I saw something that made my stomach drop. At first glance, it looked like a large branch sticking out at a weird angle. But then my flashlight caught a glossy sheen. It was a creature, something thin and long, with what looked like dark, reflective scales. The scales weren't shiny like a snake's skin, but more like overlapping mineral plates that caught the light and threw it back in dull flashes of color. Its head was slightly raised, shaped vaguely like a lizard or a snake, but bulkier, more solid. I remember the eyes. They seemed to reflect my flashlight beam, glowing faintly, which sent a shock through me. I wanted to run, but my legs locked up. We all stood there, no one daring to speak. I think we just hoped it wouldn't notice us. I didn't see arms or legs in a normal way, just this elongated body, ridged and twisting, partly hidden by the roots and dirt. It was breathing too, I swear. I saw the slight movement of its chest or whatever passed for one, and there was a low humming or rumbling sound I could feel in my bones, not loud but present, like a big cat's purr but deeper. My friend, one of the guys in our group, took a step back, and a dry branch snapped under his foot. It sounded like a gunshot in that silence. The creature's head turned just a fraction, and I saw its eyes narrow, focusing right on us. I was sure it would rush forward, maybe lash out. Instead, It just stared with this weird intensity, like it was sizing us up. I felt goosebumps run down my arms. I've never felt more out of place and vulnerable. There we were, a bunch of clueless hikers, standing in front of something that clearly didn't belong in a normal wildlife guidebook. No one spoke. Eventually, I started moving backwards slowly, trying not to lose my footing on the uneven ground. The others followed suit, keeping our flashlights on it. It never lunged or hissed. It just watched, as if letting us know we had crossed some line we didn't understand. Once we were a few steps out of the clearing, I saw it lower its head slightly, blending back into the shadows under that fallen tree. We practically stumbled our way back, not saying much. Our breathing was loud, and my heart wouldn't slow down. When we made it back to our campsite, we didn't really talk about it. I remember sitting by the cold fire pit, rubbing my eyes and trying to process what I'd seen. It didn't look like anything I knew existed in those woods. I kept expecting one of my friends to start laughing and say it was a prank, but no one did. We just sat there, occasionally glancing over our shoulders, making sure nothing had followed us. The next morning, we packed up at first light. Nobody argued about cutting the trip short. On the drive back into Quincy, someone made a half-hearted joke about reporting Godzilla to the park rangers, but no one laughed. When we got into town, I remember we tried bringing it up to a local over coffee, just vaguely like, "Hey, ever see anything weird out there?" They gave us a look like we were nuts. That shut us up pretty fast. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. We never tried to share it widely or tell the story to people who might call us liars. Even among ourselves, we talked about it maybe twice after it happened. It never felt comfortable to discuss. I still go hiking sometimes, but I stay away from that part of the redwoods. The memory still creeps me out. It's like we stumbled into something not meant for us, something that existed quietly on the edge of human understanding. After we left, everything returned to normal, as if it never happened at all. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't some trick of the light. It's been years, and I still have no clue what that thing was. Story 7. I remember it was early summer of 1998, near Eatonville, Washington, when I finally made it to Mount Rainier National Park. I'd been traveling alone through the Pacific Northwest, trying to escape the usual tourist spots and find a more genuine solitude. The place was known for its breathtaking landscapes, and I was excited to capture some unique photos. That morning, everything seemed normal. I started on a well-maintained trail, passing through some old evergreens, and the sky was clear. I remember the air felt fresher than anywhere I'd been before. No car engines, no voices, just the distant rush of water somewhere unseen. I thought I'd found the perfect escape. As the day went on, I kept hiking deeper, looking for a spot to set up my small tent before dusk. At first, I saw a few deer in the distance, grazing quietly. They looked calm, completely unbothered by my presence. I took some photos and moved on. But as I got farther from the main trails, something about the silence started getting to me. I mean, a forest is supposed to be quiet, but not like that. Usually you hear birds, insects, the wind moving branches. This silence was something else. It felt like I'd stepped into a room where everyone had just stopped talking right before I entered. Around midday, I climbed up to a kind of makeshift lookout point. The view was incredible, Mount Rainier's snow-covered peak shining against the blue sky. But I noticed something odd. The stillness was even stronger there. I couldn't hear any birds, no distant chatter from other hikers, just my own breathing. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe this part of the park just happened to be quiet. I thought I'd appreciate the peace and moved on. As afternoon crept in, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for my camp. It wasn't a designated site, but I was far enough from any main trail that I wasn't bothering anyone. The ground was level, soft with old pine needles. I pitched my tent and decided to rest a bit before trying to catch the sunset. I sat down, took a long sip from my water bottle, and looked around. The forest felt old here. The trees had thick trunks twisted in strange ways, their roots knuckling out of the ground. Something about the shapes of those roots and branches bothered me. They looked like silhouettes of crouching figures if I squinted, but I tried to ignore that feeling. By late afternoon, a kind of haze started to roll in. Not a thick fog, just a subtle mist that made the trees blur at the edges. It gave me a sense of being watched, though I couldn't pinpoint from where. I noticed my watch, and somehow the time felt off. I'd been sitting there maybe 10 minutes, but when I checked, nearly half an hour had passed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just tired. As the daylight faded, I decided not to venture too far. I took a few more photos, but the light was getting strange, almost muted. That's when I realized something else. I hadn't heard a single bird since early morning. No rustle in the underbrush. Just that eerie silence. And now, the silence seemed to have a weight, like you could feel it pressing down on your ears. Nightfall came faster than I expected. The moon was out, brighter than usual, but the forest still seemed oddly dark under the trees. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to relax. At first, I told myself everything was fine. I was just spooked from being alone in unfamiliar territory. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was more than just an absence of sound. It felt alive, like it was a thing circling outside, waiting. I don't know how much time passed, but I must have dozed off. I woke up to a faint sound, almost a whistle, but softer, like someone trying to hum quietly. It wasn't a tune I recognized. It was just a single low note that rose and fell. I held my breath, thinking maybe I was dreaming. But it happened again, moving around my tent, from one side to the other. I reached for my flashlight, hand shaking, and turned it on. The beam of light cut through the thin tent fabric, but all it showed were the shapes of trees outside. No shadows that looked human, no obvious source of the sound. The whistling stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe it was the wind, but there was no wind. The air was completely still. Then I heard a soft crack, like a twig snapping under light pressure. Not the kind of snap you hear when a large animal steps on a branch, but more like something carefully pressing down. I froze, not daring to unzip the tent. There was this instinctive fear kicking in, telling me that whatever was out there wasn't something I wanted to see. My mind raced. Could it be another hiker messing with me, some local trying to scare off strangers? I almost convinced myself of that, until the whistle started again, circling the tent, never rushing, always moving slowly, as if it was probing for a reaction. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I finally gathered the courage to unzip the tent just a tiny bit, maybe 2 inches, and shine my flashlight through the gap. I saw nothing unusual, just trees and empty forest. I closed the zipper quickly, feeling foolish for even looking. But then something tapped lightly against the fabric of my tent, just once. It was gentle, almost polite, but it made my skin crawl. I couldn't see a hand or a branch pressing in, just that subtle brush from the outside. The silence returned, thicker than before. I kept the flashlight off, thinking maybe if I stayed quiet and still, it would go away. I listened, straining my ears. Eventually I heard something like a distant whisper. Not words, just a soft hiss, like air escaping between teeth. It faded, then the silence came back. Minutes felt like hours. My eyes were wide open in the dark, every muscle in my body tense. I tried to remember if I'd locked my car, how far away I was from the nearest road. I felt more isolated than I ever had in my life. Eventually, exhaustion must have overcome fear, because I drifted off again. When I woke, it was morning. The sun was filtering through the trees, and everything looked normal. The oppressive silence was gone. I could hear distant birds again, the soft rustle of leaves. It was as if the forest had been holding its breath all night, and finally exhaled. I stepped out of my tent, half expecting to see tracks or disturbed ground. But there was nothing. The clearing looked exactly as it did when I arrived. No footprints, no snapped branches. My gear was untouched. I felt this overwhelming urge to leave immediately. I packed up in record time and started hiking back, retracing my steps. The forest felt different now, almost welcoming. A few squirrels darted across the path. I even heard a distant woodpecker, but the memory of that night was burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd wandered into a place I shouldn't have, that something old and quiet had taken notice of me. Back in town, I mentioned it casually to a few locals, just that the park felt strange, that I'd had a rough night. I expected them to laugh it off, and some did. Others just gave me this uncomfortable look, like they knew something they wouldn't say out loud. I never got any concrete explanation. No one told me about a ghost story or a legend, just awkward smiles and silence. I've looked at the photos I took many times since then. They're all normal: trees, trails, the mountain in the distance. Nothing unusual shows up. Still, I know what I felt. That silence wasn't normal. The whistle, the tap, that weird sense that time was off. It all happened. I can't explain it. I don't have some grand theory. But I know that night wasn't just a trick of my imagination. To this day, whenever someone mentions Mount Rainier, I get this chill. I remember that heavy silence, and how it felt like something was standing just outside my tent, patiently observing, testing my nerves. I left that place feeling humbled and unsettled, and I've never gone camping alone like that again. I guess some things out there are better left undisturbed, and that's all I know. It happened, it ended, and I still don't have any answers. Story 8. I remember it was sometime in late September 2005 when I was working as a seasonal ranger near Yosemite, not far from Oakhurst. I'd been out in the backcountry for a couple of hours, walking along a section not frequented by tourists, off the marked trails where the park's routine hum just fades out. Normally I'd just be checking for illegal campsites, picking up discarded gear, noting any animal tracks, that sort of thing. But that day, something was off almost from the start. The first thing I noticed was a set of camping utensils, an old fork, a spoon, and a mess tin, just lying on a mossy log near a small creek. They looked dirty and worn, but not old enough to have been abandoned for years. The weird part was that there was no tent, no sleeping bag, no fire ring nearby, no footprints, nothing. Just these items carefully placed on top of the log, arranged too neatly to be random. It gave me a strange feeling, but I shrugged it off, thinking maybe someone got spooked, left in a hurry, and this was all they dropped. As I kept moving along a narrow ravine, I began to sense this odd tension in the air. At first it was subtle. The birds seemed to be quieter. The rustling in the underbrush seemed more distant. I stopped a couple of times, listening, trying to pick out any familiar sound. A deer stepping on twigs, maybe a distant squirrel chatter. Instead, I caught a faint noise that didn't fit. It was low, almost like someone humming under their breath, but not in any melody I recognized. It came from somewhere ahead, near a bend where the creek curved behind a cluster of boulders. When I stepped forward to investigate, the sound just died out, like it knew I was coming. Around that bend, I found what I can only describe as deliberate arrangements in the brush. Small branches woven together, leaves twisted into patterns. It didn't look like something the wind or rain could have done. It was too specific. Some of these clusters were shaped almost like small fences or barriers, placed at odd intervals near the water. I knelt down to inspect one of them and noticed thin strands of what looked like grass braided together, wrapping around twigs. I have no idea who would have done that or why, especially out here where no casual hiker would wander. I tried to stay calm, but I had this growing sense that I wasn't alone. I'd look behind me every so often, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was never anyone. Just trees, brush, and the quiet movement of the creek. I remember the humidity, the smell of damp earth, and how even those natural scents seemed muted somehow, like the place was holding its breath. As I kept moving, I came across a section of forest floor that looked disturbed. At first, I thought maybe a bear had scratched around looking for insects. But it wasn't random claw marks. It looked like someone had scraped away the top layer of leaves and dirt in a broad circle, leaving a smooth patch of bare earth. On this patch, I found more of those little branch arrangements, laid out in a star-like formation, and in the very center, there was a small piece of torn cloth. It was dark green, the kind a backpacker's jacket might be made of, and it was pinned to the ground by a sharpened stick. I remember bending down, touching it, feeling the moist soil under my fingertips, and getting this intense urge to leave that spot immediately, like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. I kept moving, trying not to panic, telling myself it had to be just some weird prank. But I never saw a single footprint that day, not one that looked human. The ground was soft in places. I would have at least expected a boot imprint if a person did this. And yet there was evidence of human-like activity everywhere. The forest got quieter. I don't mean it got peaceful, I mean it turned dead silent. I couldn't hear any birds, no insects, not even the wind, just the sound of my own breathing and my boots pressing into the forest floor. At one point, I turned off my flashlight. The sun was low, but there was still enough light to see, just to listen more closely. It felt like pressing my ear against a wall of emptiness. That's when I heard it again, that low, guttural sound I'd heard earlier. It was closer now, but I still couldn't pinpoint the direction. I decided I'd had enough and wanted to start heading back. I knew the general direction of the main trail, so I angled that way, walking faster than normal. As I moved, I got the sense that something was moving parallel to me. I never saw it, only felt it. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, like a dark shape slipping behind a tree trunk. Every time I turned my head, I saw nothing but branches and shadows. At some point, I tried to take a photo. I had this small camera with me, a cheap digital one. I fumbled it out of my pack, turned it on, and snapped a few shots in the direction where I thought I saw something move. The flash went off, lighting up a cluster of trees. Nothing there. I tried another angle. Still nothing. But after taking those pictures, the feeling got worse, like whatever was out there didn't appreciate my attempt to capture it. The air seemed heavier, and I swear I felt the temperature drop a few degrees. A chill ran down my back, and I realized I was sweating despite the cold sensation. As I got closer to a familiar landmark, a large rock formation I knew was about half a mile from where I'd set off that morning, the atmosphere felt suffocating. It was like every step I took was being watched. The silence was absolute. Not even the sound of the creek reached my ears anymore. I was actually relieved when I finally caught a glimpse of a distant clearing that would lead me back toward the main trail. Then, just as suddenly as all of this had started, it seemed to fade. The eerie silence lifted a bit, and I heard the distant call of a bird. Normal forest sounds easing back in. I stopped and looked around. Everything looked ordinary again, just trees, bushes, rocks, nothing out of place. I listened for that humming or growling sound. Nothing. The air felt normal. I waited, half expecting something to burst out of the brush, but it never did. When I eventually made it out of that section of forest, I felt drained. It's hard to explain, but it was like I'd been holding my breath for hours. I didn't mention this to anyone else that evening, not the specific details anyway. I just said I had a weird day, that I got spooked by something. Most of my colleagues would laugh or say I was just jumpy. Who would believe me if I said I found strange woven branches, perfectly arranged utensils, and heard sounds that had no business being out there? Even now, I have no real explanation for what I encountered. I never got a clear look at anyone or anything. I never saw footprints, never found any official report that could back me up. But I know what I felt. Something watching me. Something placing those branches and cloth scraps on purpose. The memory of that humming, that low, guttural, voice-like noise still makes my stomach knot up. To this day, I don't like thinking about it. It happened, and then it just stopped. Like whoever or whatever was out there decided to let me go. I left that job at the end of the season and never returned to that exact area. And honestly, I don't think I'd want to. I can't explain it, but something in those woods didn't belong to the normal order of things, and I'm not in a rush to ever experience that feeling again. Story 9. Back in 1990, when I was just a student trying to make sense of the world around me, I decided to explore a protected area near Chardon, Ohio. My goal that day was straightforward. I needed samples of local plant species for a biology project. I was eager, maybe a bit naive, but I'd been in the woods many times before and never had a reason to be nervous. That morning, I set out early, wanting to get in and out before dusk. The place I chose was known for its dense forests and underused trails. I remember the air being unusually still as soon as I arrived. Normally I'd hear birdsong, the chirping of insects, maybe the distant rustling of small animals. But not that day. It was dead quiet, except for a soft breeze that barely moved the leaves. I tried not to overthink it. Sometimes forests just have these strange moods. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe the animals were foraging elsewhere. Still, I couldn't shake that unsettling silence. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, and that put me on edge. As I followed a narrow trail, I noticed something else was off. There were hardly any animal tracks. Usually I'd see deer prints, maybe a raccoon's paw marks here and there. Instead, I found nothing but layers of old leaves and a creeping low mist that hovered close to the ground. It was just thick enough to hide the forest floor in certain spots. I kept glancing down, making sure I didn't step into a hole or trip over a root. The mist gave everything this weird, muted appearance, and I felt like I was the only living thing around. I spent most of the afternoon collecting samples of plants, crouching under large ferns, carefully cutting small leaf specimens, labeling them, and tucking them into my pack. Late in the afternoon, just when I thought I should head back, I heard a sharp snap of a branch not too far away. I instantly froze, my heart in my throat, and pointed my flashlight, the forest's canopy had darkened earlier than expected, toward the sound. I saw nothing but tree trunks and a few tangled bushes. No movement, no eyes reflecting back. I tried telling myself it was probably just a branch falling on its own, or maybe an animal startled by my presence. Still, the feeling that I was being watched started to settle deep into my mind. At that point, I decided I'd gathered enough. I began to head back the way I came. Oddly, the return path seemed longer, as if the trail had stretched while I was busy. The light was shifting toward dusk, painting everything in reddish hues, and the shadows of the trees looked twisted. I remember trying to stay calm, talking to myself silently, going over what I had collected and planning my lab work for the next day. But inside, I was panicking a little. I felt like something was off, something I couldn't define. The silence was even heavier now. It pressed on my ears. I suddenly realized I couldn't find the main trail. It should have been right there, I'd followed the same route I'd taken in the morning, but it was like the brush and ferns had closed in. I double-checked my map and compass, refusing to believe I'd gotten lost. I knew these woods well enough. I took a deep breath and picked a direction that I believed would lead me back to the proper path. The forest felt different, though, like it was shifting. Every few steps, I found the vegetation denser, as if it were intentionally blocking my way. I refused to panic, but my heart was beating so fast I could practically feel it in my throat. That's when I heard it, a low, raspy sound that reminded me of a muffled growl. It didn't sound like any animal I'd heard before. Not exactly a bear, not exactly a wolf, something in between, and something that never fully revealed itself. I glanced over my shoulder while still walking forward, trying not to lose my footing, and I thought I caught sight of a shape moving behind a cluster of trees. It was tall, too tall for a deer, and it seemed to keep pace with me, always staying just behind the thicker trunks. I tried to move faster, telling myself I was imagining things. But every time I looked back, I'd see a hint of something stepping out of view just in time. I never saw it clearly, just a silhouette that suggested it stood on two legs, or maybe it was balanced in some unnatural way. My breathing got louder in my own ears. I tried to keep quiet, not to attract more attention, but I was terrified. I wasn't just lost. I was being followed by something I couldn't identify. Eventually, I spotted a familiar bend in the landscape, a subtle incline I recognized. If I was right, a small offshoot of the main trail was just past that rise. I headed that way, not daring to look back again. My legs were shaking, and the silence was occasionally broken by that strange, throaty noise that never got closer, but never faded either. It was as if it wanted me to know it was there, following, but not yet ready to approach. My mind was racing through possibilities. Was it an injured animal, a person messing with me? But why would anyone do that out here, in the middle of nowhere? When I finally found a stretch of path that I recognized, I practically ran. I didn't care if I made noise anymore. I wanted to get out. I remember my hair standing on end as I reached the trailhead where I'd parked my old car. I fumbled with my keys, trying to keep an eye on the tree line. I swear I saw some leaves move in an odd way, as if something heavy was shifting behind them. I got into the car, started the engine, and took off. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw a shape, maybe just branches or shadows, I'm not sure, move in a manner that was too purposeful to be the wind. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I sped back to town, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Later that evening, I told a close friend, another biology student, what happened. She tried to reassure me. Maybe it was a lone wolf, a bear, or something else that's shy or rare. She said my nerves probably got the best of me. But even now, so many years later, I still can't make sense of what I encountered. I've been in many forests and heard all kinds of animal calls, but nothing fits that guttural sound I heard. And the feeling of being watched, analyzed even, stays with me. It was like this thing knew I didn't belong there and wanted me gone, but not before making sure I felt completely vulnerable. I've never gone back to that exact spot. I can't bring myself to do it. I don't know what I experienced, and I'm not sure I want to know. Whatever it was, it let me leave. It could have shown itself fully or harmed me, but it didn't. I drove away that day, and the weird silence of that forest lingered in my mind for a long time. Even now, every time I think about it, I get goosebumps. The forest that day felt like something alive, something aware, and I'll never forget that uneasy quiet and the shadows that followed me home. Story 10. Back in the summer of 1982, I was a young anthropology grad student trying to make a name for myself. I was doing fieldwork near Franklin, Idaho, chasing old rumors and scraps of historical documents that talked about a place called Barrow Springs. I'd been in that area for a few days, scanning old maps, trying to piece together something tangible, something that could tie folklore to real native cultural traces. It felt like a wild goose chase, but I was stubborn and maybe a bit too eager to find something nobody else had confirmed before. That morning, I woke up before dawn and set off carrying only a small backpack with my notebooks, a tape recorder, my maps, and some basic gear. The air was crisp, still smelling of pine and damp earth. I remember how the canopy above filtered the early sunlight, making the leaves glow an odd, almost dull green. I followed a faint trail I'd marked on my map, a path that wasn't really a trail at all, more like a subtle gap in the undergrowth. I kept going for hours, pushing through thick brush, mossy logs, and ground that got steadily more uneven. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. I don't mean a normal forest quiet, where you still hear birds or insects. I mean a silence that felt deliberate, as if everything around me was holding its breath, waiting. By the time I reached a slight slope going down, the silence felt nearly suffocating. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling this strange tension, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The ground under my boots changed texture, damp, almost spongy. My map suggested I should find some kind of water source in that area, so I pressed on. After a few more minutes, I saw it. A small marshy spot, a natural spring gently bubbling up from under the moss. The water was so clear, I could see tiny pebbles shifting at the bottom. Around it, stones were arranged in a rough circle, not perfectly shaped or anything, but clearly not random. A few of them had faint markings, small lines and grooves that looked intentional. I knelt down, heart pounding with excitement and anxiety, and started to record my thoughts out loud. The date, the time, the location, the condition of the stones, the water clarity. My voice sounded strange in that silence. As I leaned closer, I could feel a slight warmth from the water, just a subtle difference in temperature. I noticed a few carved lines on one of the larger stones, something like a pattern, but I couldn't make it out clearly. I took notes, tried to sketch it, and then I paused. Something felt off. You know when you sense you're being watched, and every hair on your body starts to stand on end. I got that feeling suddenly, a jolt of electricity down my spine. I lifted my head and looked around slowly, trying not to be too obvious. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a branch or maybe moss hanging strangely from a tree. But as I focused, I realized it was a figure, tall, lean, draped in something that blended in with the foliage. It had this greenish-gray tone, and I couldn't tell if it was clothing, some natural camouflage, or something else entirely. It stood maybe 20-30 feet away, partially hidden behind ferns and leaves. Its shape was human-like, but impossibly slender. When my eyes met its face, or where its face should be, I caught a reflection of light in what looked like eyes. They weren't glowing dramatically, but they caught the sunlight in a way that startled me. They seemed curious, almost analyzing me. In that moment, I froze. My chest tightened, and I remember feeling a surge of panic and disbelief. I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I just stayed crouched by the spring, notebook half open, tape recorder still running. My mouth went dry. I tried to look calm, or at least not threatening. I wanted to speak, to say something, but the words didn't come. It didn't look hostile, at least not in the obvious sense, but I sensed it wasn't friendly either. It felt like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. I have no idea how long we stayed like that, locked in that bizarre, tense standoff. My heart hammered in my ears. Finally, it tilted its head slightly to the side, a strange, unnatural movement. Then it shifted backwards, stepping soundlessly deeper into the shadows, until I could no longer separate its form from the rest of the vegetation. It was as if it just dissolved back into the forest. The silence lingered, thick and unnerving. I don't know what compelled me to stay there a bit longer. Maybe I was in shock. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe a trick of the light, an unusual branch, a person in strange clothing. But nothing fit. The feeling that it was a living being, something aware of me, was too strong. Eventually I forced myself to stand, pack up my stuff, and leave. My legs felt weak and shaky. Every step away from that spring took more courage than I'd ever needed in my life. Oddly, the way back seemed shorter, easier, almost as if the forest was now gently guiding me out. The silence lifted somewhat. I could make out distant birds again. My watch showed that not even half the day had passed, but I felt completely drained, as if I'd been out there for days. Once I got back to the edge of the park, I was sweating and trembling. I never told anyone the full story, just mentioned some stones and a spring when people asked what I found. I hid the part about that figure because I knew how it would sound. Even now, all these years later, I struggle to put it into words that don't sound ridiculous. I've tried to go over it logically so many times since then. I've thought about costumes, weird angles of light, rare animals, even a fellow researcher trying to scare me. None of it explains that eerie feeling or how the figure seemed to blend into the landscape so effortlessly. Nothing explains how it seemed to be waiting there, guarding that spring, those stones, those old carvings I couldn't decipher. I can still remember the exact smell of the moss and the water, the texture of the damp ground beneath my boots, and especially that oppressive silence that made the whole experience feel like stepping into another world. After that day, Barrow Springs became something I never attempted to reach again. I don't even know if I could find it now. The area is large and unmapped in many places, but the memory is enough. Sometimes I still dream about those eyes, how they caught the light. I don't have a neat conclusion. The experience just ended as abruptly as it began. I left that spot, and that presence vanished. No grand revelation, no final proof. It still bothers me, because I'm an academic by nature. I like evidence, data, things I can explain. But there's nothing here I can fully explain, and that's what haunts me to this day. Story 11. Back in 1994, I was in my mid-20s, and I thought I knew everything about hiking off the beaten path. My cousin and I decided to spend a weekend near Paintsville, Kentucky, exploring a part of the mountains we'd heard about, places not on the usual maps. We both had done plenty of night hikes, sometimes just to push our limits, sometimes to find hidden spots that most people ignored. That weekend, though, we ended up in an area known as Day Ridge. It wasn't famous for anything. No signs, no campgrounds, just thick vegetation and trails that looked like they'd barely been touched in years. The first day, we hiked in with no issues. The forest felt normal at first. I remember birds singing, insects buzzing around, little critters darting under ferns. We spent hours following faint paths and stepping over mossy logs. At some point, maybe mid-afternoon, I noticed something odd. The forest started going quiet. We were used to lulls in the background noise, but this was different. It was as if someone hit a mute button. Birds just stopped. Insects that had been everywhere vanished. We couldn't even hear distant water or wind in the leaves. It felt wrong. We joked about it, tried to brush it off, but it weighed on us. There's a certain tension that builds when the woods go silent. You start paying more attention to every step, wondering if something else is paying attention too. That evening we set up camp. It was a rough spot on a gentle slope, with enough flat ground for our tent. We had a small fire going, ate some dried food, and planned the route for the next day. We turned in early, both of us feeling a bit uneasy, though we didn't say it out loud. I remember lying there in my sleeping bag, listening hard and catching nothing but my own breathing and maybe my cousin's slight snores. After a while, I must have drifted off. What woke me up was a low, muffled growl. Not loud, but close. I sat up, heart pounding. My cousin was already sitting up too, whispering, "Did you hear that?" without actually saying it, just mouthing it in the dark. We grabbed our flashlights, waited a moment, and then flicked them on. I expected to see the shape of a bear, or maybe a wildcat, but the beams just caught brush and twisted trunks. Still, I could hear something moving around us. Heavy footsteps on damp ground, a crunch of leaves, then silence. We stayed quiet, flashlights sweeping back and forth, straining our eyes. If it had been a bear, I think it would have either run off or charged, but this thing seemed to circle. I caught a glimpse of branches shaking but never saw what moved them. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the sound faded. We were too rattled to sleep. We kept the lights on for hours, waiting for another growl. It never came. When dawn finally broke, we stepped outside, checking the ground around our camp. We found footprints. Big ones, larger than anything we'd ever seen out there. They weren't quite round like a bear's paw. They had a weird shape to them, almost like elongated prints with some kind of claw marks, but arranged in a way that didn't fit any animal we knew. It looked like a messed-up cross between a human footprint and something with talons. We just stared at each other, no words coming out. I remember my cousin muttering something like, "What the hell?" under his breath. Neither of us dared to say it was fake or some trick of the mud. It was too clear, and it was definitely fresh. We could have left right then. We talked about it, but like idiots, we decided to push on a bit further. We reasoned that maybe we'd run into a more familiar trail closer to the ridge. We said if we felt uneasy, we'd head back by afternoon. So we packed up and moved on. That day, the silence got worse. No birds, no animals. Just us, our footsteps, and sometimes the wind. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I felt like I was being watched all the time. Every so often I'd swear I heard a branch snap in the distance, but whenever I stopped to listen, I got nothing. As the afternoon faded, that dread started to build again. We set camp earlier, in a spot that felt more open, hoping we'd see anything approaching. We barely talked. My heart was pounding, and I had a splitting headache, probably from stress and lack of proper sleep. Night fell, and with it came that feeling of being surrounded, even though we saw nothing. We kept our flashlights and a small fire going. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, making weird patterns on the ground. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural grunt, deeper than the night before. We both froze. My cousin slowly shined his flashlight in the direction of the sound. For a second, I wished he wouldn't. I had this horrible feeling that we didn't really want to see what it was. But he did, and I saw something step behind a trunk, just enough for the beam to catch its outline. It was tall. I don't know exactly how tall, but definitely more than a foot or two taller than me, and I'm about 6 feet. It was covered in thick, dark hair or fur, not smooth like a bear, more ragged. It had this hunched posture, like it was ready to drop to all fours if it needed to. I couldn't see its face well, just a flash of eyeshine that reflected the light back at us, and in that reflection, I sensed something aware, not just an animal reacting to a threat. We didn't move. My cousin took a small step forward, I guess trying to show we weren't afraid. Bad move. The thing snarled, louder this time, and I caught sight of teeth. Long, yellowish teeth that looked wrong, not like the even fangs of a predator, but jagged. It didn't charge. It just stared for a moment, then slipped behind the trees again. Its movement was unsettling. It was fast but quiet, and I swear it walked on 2 legs, though it might have dropped down at times. It left us there, shaking and unsure if we should run or hold our ground. We spent the rest of that night wide awake. I felt sick to my stomach. We decided that at first light we'd pack everything and get out. No more exploring. We didn't say much to each other. Fear had a way of keeping us silent. I tried to piece together what that thing could have been, but my brain came up empty. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It wasn't any normal animal I knew about. Morning came, and we just grabbed our gear and started walking back the way we came. Or at least we thought we were. The trail didn't look right. Trees that I remembered passing on our way in didn't seem to be in the same spots. We stumbled over logs that seemed new. It was as if the forest rearranged itself overnight. That sounds crazy, I know, but everything felt off. We kept pushing forward, double-checking our compass. The silence persisted, broken only by our own frustrated curses. Once I thought I saw a shadow move in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, there was nothing. Another time, I heard something like a faint grunt far behind us, but I never saw anything following. We ended up taking longer than expected to get back. Hours longer. The entire time I was sure it was still out there, maybe watching from a safe distance. It never showed itself again, but I felt it. It's hard to describe that kind of tension. It's like the whole forest wanted us gone. When we finally emerged near a known trail and made our way out of the woods, I remember feeling a wave of relief so strong it almost made me cry. But when we got back into town and tried telling a couple of trusted folks, we got laughter, disbelief, or just blank stares. We couldn't blame them. If I hadn't seen it myself, I'd never have believed it. We never went back. Not to that exact place anyway. And we stopped with the night hikes into unknown areas. Something about that weekend changed us. It's been years, and even now, whenever I think about those footprints or that snarl echoing in the dark, I get chills. I can't explain what we saw. To this day, I have no neat conclusion. No one's come forward with similar encounters that I know of, and I haven't read any official reports about strange creatures in that area. It just happened, then it ended, and life went on. But every once in a while, late at night, I remember the way those eyes caught the flashlight's beam. I remember that awful silence, and I realize how close we were to something that simply does not fit into any category I know. I can't prove a thing. We left no evidence besides our own shaken memories, and even if I could, who would believe it? All I know is that we went to Day Ridge to explore, and we came back feeling like we'd trespassed on something that's better left alone. After all these years, I still can't shake the sense that whatever we encountered out there wasn't just an animal, and it definitely didn't want us around. It still haunts me that we have no answers, just a memory that refuses to fade. Story 12. It happened back in late 2019, near Townsend, Tennessee, when I was working as a park ranger. I still remember that day so vividly. It was one of those clear, chilly afternoons where the air tastes like damp leaves and cold stone. I'd been a ranger for years, so the woods didn't usually throw me off. I knew the trails, the regular visitors, the sounds and scents that come with different seasons. Nothing should have surprised me at that point, but this one hiker I ran into changed that. I first saw him about an hour after starting my routine patrol. He was tall and thin, wearing this light, almost old-fashioned jacket, way too thin for the altitude and the cold that day. His hair was silver, kind of shoulder length, which isn't so weird by itself, but combined with everything else, it just felt off. He stood on the edge of a narrow trail that overlooks a river bend. I remember how still he was, just flipping through a small, dark-covered book. When I approached and said something like, "Afternoon, sir," he looked up and greeted me with this odd smile. He said, "Good day, Ranger," in a tone that felt like he'd stepped out of another century. The words sounded too formal, too old-fashioned. I tried to warn him about the temperature, how the weather could turn, and that he should have some proper gear. He just nodded without really engaging. Before I could press him further, he walked off with a strange, almost graceful motion, and I realized he was heading off trail. There were no official paths where he was going. I called after him, but he either didn't hear or pretended not to. I didn't chase him right then. I regret that now. But I was caught off guard. Usually, people don't just wander off like that. About 40 minutes later, I spotted him again. I couldn't believe it. The section where I saw him first and where I found him next wasn't close at all, and to get there so fast, he would have had to jog or at least move really quickly. But he looked calm, unhurried, still wearing that stupidly thin jacket. He was leaning against a tree, looking at something across a small ravine. When I tried to get closer, I heard a low growl. On the opposite side of the ravine stood a black wolf, larger than any I'd seen out here, with these intense eyes that caught the moonlight filtering through the branches. The animal didn't snarl or make a move. It just stared, locked onto the hiker like they understood each other somehow. I hesitated. Wolves aren't common in this exact area, especially one that big and that bold, just standing there. I took a step closer, carefully, and turned my flashlight towards the shape. I swear, in that split second, the wolf just vanished into the brush. No sound, no rustling of leaves, just gone. I turned back to the hiker, but he was already looking straight at me, kind of smiling but not in a friendly way. More like he was sad or disappointed. He said something quiet. I'm almost sure it was "they've returned." And then he stepped behind a cluster of trees. When I followed, he wasn't there. No footprints, no sound of snapping branches, nothing. It made my skin crawl. The forest felt heavier, quieter, like I'd walked into a place I shouldn't be. After that, I tried to refocus on my usual route, checking campsites and making sure no one was lost or in trouble. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods had changed. I started noticing odd details. A sudden hush would fall over areas usually full of birdsong. I came across the remains of a deer, except they didn't look like remains that had been picked apart by scavengers. The carcass was almost intact, just drained. The eyes were wide open, the body stiff but not torn up. It looked wrong, too clean. I've never seen anything like that. My stomach turned, and I felt this rush of anxiety I couldn't explain. It was like the forest itself was trying to warn me. As dusk settled, I heard weird sounds. Not animal calls, not wind. Just these faint, distant hums, like someone murmuring in a language I couldn't identify. Each time I stopped and turned my head, the sound seemed to come from a different direction. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an echo, maybe a couple of visitors playing a prank, but it didn't feel like a prank. My heart was pounding, and my flashlight beam felt too weak against the growing darkness. Then I saw him again. This time, he was standing at the edge of a cliff that overlooks a valley below. The moon was out, bright but somehow not comforting. He stood there, reading from that small, dark book, turning a page every few seconds, not bothered by the cold wind that had started to whip through the trees. I approached slowly, calling out, "What are you doing? Are you lost?" My voice sounded shaky, which pissed me off. I hated that I was scared. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw his eyes clearly. They looked old and tired, but not in a human way, like something ancient was looking back at me through a human face. He didn't smile this time. He just closed his book, stared at me for a moment, and said, "They test your kind. They always have." His voice was quiet, but I heard every word, as if they cut right through the wind. I wanted to ask him who they were, why he was here, what he wanted. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I was frozen. Then he tilted his head, almost politely, and stepped right off the edge of the cliff. My heart jumped into my throat. I rushed forward, expecting to see him falling, maybe hanging onto a ledge. But when I got to the edge, there was just darkness and the distant shapes of treetops below. I scanned with my flashlight, my eyes, anything I could do. No one was there. No sound of a body hitting rocks, no cry, nothing. I scrambled around the cliff edge looking for footprints, disturbed earth, something, but all I found was untouched ground. It was like he'd never been there. By then, my nerves were shot. I felt a cold sweat on my back, and my hands were shaking. I don't usually lose my cool out there. Part of being a ranger is keeping calm, even when you come across bear tracks or injured hikers who need help. But this was different. This felt wrong, like I'd stepped into a story someone else wrote, not the real world I knew. I should have left right then, but I was worried about the possibility of a real person needing help. Maybe he was a lost hiker, just acting strangely. Maybe he'd fallen somewhere I couldn't see. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. No normal human moves around a park that fast. No normal human scares off a giant wolf by just staring, and no normal human disappears off a cliff edge without a trace. I spent the next hour combing the area, shining my flashlight into every possible hiding place. The only thing I found was an old piece of fabric caught on a thorny bush. It was dark and thin, could have been from a scarf or a jacket lining. I wasn't sure. I put it in my pocket. After that, the forest got eerily quiet again, as if holding its breath. It felt like something had left, or maybe something was done with me. I eventually headed back, keeping my flashlight low to avoid tripping on exposed roots. My mind was racing with questions. Should I report this? Would anyone believe me? I was torn between following the standard procedures and just shutting my mouth. I knew that if I tried to explain what happened, I'd sound insane. A silver-haired stranger speaking like he's from another time, a giant black wolf that vanishes, weird sounds, and a man stepping off a cliff without a trace. No one's going to buy that. When I got back to the ranger station, it felt unreal. Everything looked normal. The radio crackled softly. The old wooden desk and the maps pinned to the walls were all exactly as I'd left them. But I felt different, like I'd been initiated into some secret that I never asked to know. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept expecting to hear that humming, or to see that tall figure staring at me through the window. But nothing else happened. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. I never officially reported it. I wrote a few notes in my personal journal, but nothing in the official logs. Over time, I tried to convince myself maybe I was just tired that day, that my mind played tricks on me because of stress or some weird phenomenon. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I know that man wasn't just a random hiker. Something old and strange walked those woods that evening, something I still can't explain. I worked there for a while longer and never saw him again. No one else ever mentioned a tall, silver-haired man in outdated clothes. I didn't hear any more strange humming. But that single day never left my mind. Even now I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, remembering that black wolf's stare and the stranger's quiet words. They've returned. I still don't know who they are, or what that whole encounter meant, and maybe I never will. That's it. I have no grand explanation, no neat ending. It just happened, and then it stopped, like a door slammed shut behind me. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the forest has deeper secrets than we'll ever understand, and that I caught a glimpse of something I wasn't supposed to see. Story 13. I remember that day like it just happened. It was spring 2020, a bit cloudy, not too cold, but the kind of weather where the sun never fully breaks through. I decided to take my mountain bike out near Ashford, Washington, on a trail I'd ridden a dozen times before. It's part of a national forest area, tall pines, ferns all over the ground, that damp, mossy smell you usually get in the Pacific Northwest. Normally, you'd hear birds, maybe spot a chipmunk darting across the path, nothing unusual. But that afternoon felt wrong, even before I started pedaling deeper into the woods. I noticed something off almost immediately. There was this weird silence, no birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the hum of my bike's wheels and my own breathing. The air, too, it smelled like metal, almost like blood, but not quite. It's hard to describe, but the scent got stronger the further I went. The trail itself, which I knew very well, somehow felt tighter, like the trees had shifted closer. I was ducking under branches that I swear hadn't been that low the last time I rode there. It gave me a tense feeling, like I was intruding. About halfway through my planned route, I caught a noise coming from off the trail. It was a snapping sound, like thick branches being broken under something heavy. It wasn't subtle at all. I thought maybe it was a deer or an elk. There are plenty of those around. My instinct was to keep moving, but I slowed down a bit, curiosity getting the better of me. The forest was too quiet, and whatever was making that noise sounded big. I stopped, straddling my bike, and looked to my left where I'd heard the snapping. The undergrowth was pretty thick, but I could see something moving behind a cluster of dark, wet trunks. At first, I tried to force it into something familiar, like a big deer with dark fur, maybe a bear. But as it stepped forward, I realized how off my initial guess was. This thing was tall, well over 6 feet, and even though it moved on all fours at first, its back looked strangely elongated. Its legs and arms, if you could call them that, were too long and thin, not like any animal I know. I just froze. When it turned its head and looked right at me, I swear time slowed down. Its eyes were a kind of yellowish amber, glowing even in that dim light, almost like a reflection, but not quite. The shape of its face was wrong, too long, with a narrow jaw and teeth that I caught a glimpse of when it opened its mouth. It made this noise, somewhere between a grunt and a whistle, but distorted, like air escaping through a small gap in a pressurized tank. It raised every hair on my body. I couldn't move. My mind was racing, telling me to do something. I couldn't pedal backwards, and turning around would mean losing sight of it. So I did the only thing I could think of. I lifted my bike by the handlebars, sort of holding it between me and the creature. I guess I thought of it as a shield, maybe something to make me look bigger. It didn't run off. It just cocked its head, watching me, like it was curious but also annoyed. Then it made that sound again, harsher this time. I don't know what triggered it, but suddenly it rose up on 2 legs. Now it looked even bigger, definitely taller than a large man, and the shape of its torso and limbs made no sense. It had this almost human outline, but too stretched, too thin in some parts, too thick in others. Its arms hung lower than they should, and I could see muscles twitching under a weird, patchy coat of dark, almost black hair. It stood there, swaying slightly, and I realized I was shaking. I knew I couldn't just stay there. My gut told me to run, but my legs felt like cement. I forced myself onto the bike seat again and started pedaling. At first, I couldn't go fast because of the rough terrain and the roots sticking out everywhere. As soon as I moved, I heard a violent snapping behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept pumping my legs, steering around trees and rocks. The air felt heavier, that metallic smell almost burning my nostrils. And behind me, I kept hearing it. Branches cracking, leaves crunching. It was following. It's hard to describe how terrifying it is to know something so unnatural is right behind you. I kept expecting it to grab the back of my shirt or the tire of my bike. At one point, I hit a root wrong and nearly flipped over the handlebars, but I managed to steady myself and kept going. My lungs were on fire, but the adrenaline was stronger. I didn't dare to stop. I'd never ridden that fast on that trail before. I just wanted out. The whole time, that weird sound it made kept echoing in my head. I couldn't tell if I was actually hearing it still, or if it was just in my mind. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a few minutes, the trail opened up. The trees were more spaced out, and I could see the sky better. The smell was fading. I realized I couldn't hear the creature behind me anymore. No snapping branches, no distorted whistle, just my breathing and the soft hiss of my bike tires on the trail. Still, I didn't stop. I kept going until I hit the access road, where the forest meets a small gravel path that leads back to my car. When I finally stopped, I got off my bike and looked around. It was quiet, but in a normal way this time. I could hear a distant bird call, the rustling of leaves in a breeze. The metallic smell was gone. Everything felt normal again, like the forest was back to being just a forest. I tried to calm down, but my heart was still pounding. Later, when I made it back to town, I tried telling a close friend about it. He just gave me a weird look and said maybe I'd seen a moose, maybe one with a disease or something. But I know what moose look like. I've seen bears. I know the local wildlife. That thing was nothing like them. It moved wrong, looked wrong, sounded wrong. Even now, I can't explain it. I have no clue what I encountered. I remember its eyes, the way they almost glowed, and that strange whistle-like noise. I've gone over it in my head 100 times, but I still come up blank. I haven't gone back on that trail since. Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried to get a photo or something, but I was too scared to even think about my phone. Part of me wants an explanation, but another part knows that what I saw doesn't fit any explanation I'm comfortable with. It was there, and then it wasn't, leaving me with nothing but this hollow fear and confusion. I know what I experienced was real. It haunts me every time I think about riding alone in the forest again. Something was out there that day, something bigger, smarter, and more unsettling than any wild animal I've ever encountered. And just like it came out of nowhere, it vanished. I have no answers. To this day, I still don't understand what I saw. It makes me feel uneasy even now, thinking that something like that could be lurking out there, waiting, as if that whole encounter was just some twisted reminder that the woods aren't always what we think they are. Story 14. I still remember that night back in 2021, in my small house near the forest edge outside Minden, Nevada. I was going through one of my usual bouts of insomnia, the kind where I'd be lying there for hours, restless, my bedroom window slightly open so I could at least feel the cool mountain air. It wasn't unusual for me to be wide awake at 3 or 4 in the morning, staring at shadows, listening to the breeze rustling through the pines. But this time was different. This time, something was in there with me. I'm not the kind of person who jumps at creaking noises or freaks out over weird shadows. I've lived on the outskirts long enough to know what animals sound like at night, how branches scrape against the house, and how the wind can make something as simple as a piece of wood sound eerie. But that night, the silence itself felt heavy, like the air was pressing down on me. It was the kind of silence where even your own breathing feels too loud. I first noticed something was off when I suddenly woke up, not with the usual groggy confusion, but with a sudden spike of panic, like my body knew before my brain did that something was wrong. My eyes snapped open, and I just had this immediate sense I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it. A tall figure standing in the far corner of my bedroom, only a few meters from the foot of my bed. I wish I could say it looked like a regular intruder, something my rational mind could explain. But it didn't. It wore this black, hooded cloak, draped all the way down to its feet. Worse, it had some sort of mask on. At first glance it looked like a witch's face, with a long, curved nose and twisted features. It was hideous, and something about it felt off. like it wasn't just a mask. The thing didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there. I remember trying to scream, but I couldn't. My throat locked up and no sound came out, like I was paralyzed for those few seconds. Then, without warning, it vanished. I don't mean it turned around and left. I mean I blinked, and it was gone. No sound, no shift in the room's shadows, just gone. I scrambled to turn on the lamp next to my bed. The room looked the same as always. My clothes tossed on the chair, my keys on the nightstand. Nothing out of place except my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I spent the next hour pacing around, checking every corner of the house. Windows, doors. Everything was locked. I even went outside with a flashlight, checking the dirt around my bedroom window. That's when I noticed faint footprints in the soft soil near the foundation, as if someone had indeed been standing there. But they didn't look right. The shape was odd, elongated, like someone wearing strange shoes. It made no sense. I was freaked out, but exhaustion finally forced me back to bed. Somehow I managed to close my eyes again, thinking maybe I'd hallucinated the entire thing. But before sunrise, I jolted awake once more. This time, I saw the figure again. Now it stood closer to the window, and the mask was different. It looked like a clown's face, painted with a disturbing grin. That freaked me out more than the witch-like one. There was something so wrong about it being silent, just staring at me, as if studying my reactions. Again, I couldn't move. My muscles felt locked, but I was definitely awake, blinking, aware of the cold air coming through the window and the feeling of sweat collecting at the back of my neck. As soon as I managed to force myself upright, it disappeared. No sound, no steps, just the same instant vanishing. I threw on some clothes, marched outside with my flashlight, and looked around again. I thought I'd find nothing this time, but there were more footprints by the window. Slight differences in depth and angle. Something or someone had stood there more than once. I grabbed my phone and took pictures, just to have some proof. My mind was racing. This didn't feel like sleep paralysis or a bad dream. There were physical signs right outside my own house. I went back in, my nerves shot, hands shaking. I tried to sit in the living room and wait it out, hoping the morning light would somehow end this nightmare. I even set up my phone on a shelf aimed at the bedroom door, hoping I could record something if it came back. I waited, heart pounding. At some point I got restless and decided to peek into my bedroom again, phone in hand. My bed looked normal, the soft light of early dawn creeping in. Then I caught a glimpse of movement at the corner of my vision. I turned, and it was there, standing in the darkest corner, behind the door. My throat went dry. This time, the mask looked like something out of a medieval festival, a jester with tiny bells that somehow didn't make any sound. My phone shook in my hand as I tried to snap a picture, but the moment my camera focused, it vanished again. That's when I started whispering to myself, "You're not real. You're not real." But I knew it was. The footprints, the feeling in the air, this wasn't just in my head. I ran outside, circled the house, looking for any sign of a person messing with me. There was nothing, no one, just the tall trees, the scent of pine, and the distant silhouettes of mountains. Normally that view relaxed me, but now it felt like I was being watched from every angle. It was getting lighter, and I started to feel desperate. I didn't know who to call. Local police wouldn't believe my story, and I honestly wasn't sure what I'd say. There's someone appearing in my bedroom and wearing weird masks. I'd sound insane. I thought about these old local stories I'd heard around Minden, legends about strange entities in the forest that feed off fear. I remember some old guy at a hardware store once mentioned creatures that supposedly come at night. Not animals, not people, something else. At the time, I brushed it off, but now it seemed too coincidental. I decided if this thing showed up again, I wouldn't give it what it wanted. I'd just stare right back, try not to panic. Maybe it fed off my reaction. It was the only plan I had. So I went back into the house and waited. The morning light was creeping in, but still not bright enough to make me feel safe. I stood in my bedroom, trying to keep my breathing steady. And sure enough, it appeared one more time. I don't know how it just slipped into existence like that. 1 second, empty corner. The next, it was there. This time the mask had no expression, just a blank, pale face with empty eyes. I felt my stomach drop. My legs were shaking, but I held my ground, gripping the side of my dresser so I wouldn't collapse. I stared at it. My heart was racing, but I bit my lip and refused to run. I didn't scream, didn't make a sound. I just watched it, refusing to show the terror that was eating me alive from the inside. The figure tilted its head, as if confused. It lingered there, silent and still. The absence of noise was suffocating, but I just kept looking, my chest tight, my jaw clenched. After a few seconds, though it felt like forever, it simply vanished again. This time, I felt something shift in the room, as if an invisible tension had snapped. I stood there, waiting, staring at that empty corner until my legs started to ache. But it never came back. The sun rose higher, filling the room with light. Outside, the world seemed normal. Birds were chirping and a car rumbled by on the distant road. Everything looked the same as always, except I felt like I'd survived some twisted test. I spent the next hour walking around my property, checking for footprints one last time. I saw nothing new. It was as if the thing had given up. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. I don't know if it was some kind of entity, a person playing an elaborate joke, or something else entirely. All I know is that it never came back after that morning. Maybe it realized I wasn't going to give it what it wanted, my fear, and lost interest. Maybe I was lucky. I still have trouble sleeping, still wake up at odd hours, but I never saw that masked figure again. That's basically it. It happened, it stopped, and I'm left with these weird memories and a lingering feeling that out there, beyond the tree line, something watched me and tested me. And I honestly have no clue what it was or why it chose my house that night. It's been years now, and I've never been able to make sense of it. I guess I never will. Story 15. I remember that day in 2014 so clearly because everything about it felt off from the moment I stepped into that part of the park. I was there for a routine fieldwork project. My task was simple: collect mosquito larvae samples from stagnant pools and bring them back to the lab for identification and analysis. I'd done it 100 times before, in different parks all over Texas. It was never supposed to feel dangerous or unsettling. But this place, somewhere outside Meridian, had a very different vibe, one I can't fully explain even now. The afternoon started normally enough. I left my car near a ranger's outpost and hiked in. The trail should have been easy, just a few miles into denser woods, where some small streams tended to form these tiny pockets of still water. There were always plenty of mosquitoes around those pools, so it was a prime spot to get samples. But as I got deeper along the path, something struck me as wrong. It took me a while to put my finger on it, but eventually I realized it was the silence. Normally, at that time of day, I'd expect to hear birds, insects, just the general hum of life that you always find in a healthy forest. Instead, it was dead quiet. No birds calling, no rustling in the underbrush, not even the buzzing of insects. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. As I kept walking, I noticed these strange arrangements of fallen trunks and branches across the trail. They looked too deliberate to be random. It was as if someone, or something, had dragged them into place to block off certain sections. At first, I assumed maybe a storm had passed through recently and that maintenance crews hadn't cleared it yet. But the more I looked, the more it seemed like a pattern. It made me uneasy, but I tried to shrug it off. I was there to do a job, and I really didn't want to turn back empty-handed. Eventually, I found a small, narrow stream where I could dip in a net to collect larvae. That's when I noticed the smell. It hit me out of nowhere, a strong, metallic, almost bloody odor mixed with the stench of something rotting. But there were no carcasses, no visible source of the smell. It made my stomach turn. I grabbed a few water samples as quickly as I could, keeping one eye on the surrounding brush because I suddenly felt exposed. I started to feel watched. I know how that sounds, but I swear I felt eyes on me. I kept seeing movement in my peripheral vision, shadows shifting between the trees, but every time I looked directly at them, nothing was there. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination or maybe some animal that I couldn't quite spot. But the feeling wouldn't go away. A while later, I noticed footprints in the soft ground near a muddy section of the trail. They were large and oddly shaped, not like a human's, and not quite like a deer or bear either. They had a weird, almost stretched shape, as if something with an unusual gait had passed through. I was still rational enough to think maybe it was just some deformed print left by a known animal, but it didn't comfort me much. I started feeling more anxious, glancing over my shoulder more often. It was getting late, too. That was my own stupid fault. I'd lost track of time trying to find the best collection spots. As dusk fell, the silence remained. Normally, as evening approaches, you at least get the chatter of insects or the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. But it was quiet. So quiet. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, so I packed my gear and headed back. I was about halfway back to the main trail when I heard something that still makes my skin crawl. It was a voice. Not just any voice. It sounded like my own voice, only rougher and distorted. It repeated random words I'd said to myself earlier that day. I have a habit of talking to myself when I'm doing field work, just small phrases like, "Okay, let's try this spot," or "just a few more samples." Hearing those exact words come from somewhere behind me, in a voice that sounded almost like mine but off, like someone was trying to mimic me but hadn't quite nailed it, was terrifying. I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear my pulse in my ears. I spun around, shining my small flashlight into the trees. Nothing, just darkness and tangled branches. I told myself to keep moving. I picked up my pace, trying not to run because I didn't want to panic and break an ankle or something, but I was on the edge. Then I saw it, a shape between the trees, illuminated by the fading light. It stood on two legs, tall but hunched, and it had patches of fur or hair in irregular spots, like it couldn't decide if it was an animal or a man. Its eyes reflected a dull red glow when my light hit them. The shape was strange, kind of like a deer's head forced onto a human-like figure, with twisted antlers that were uneven and cracked. It moved in this unnatural, jerky way, stepping aside before I could really focus on it. Each time I tried to get a clear look, it seemed to shift position too fast, like it was toying with me. There were these clicking sounds too, like bones tapping together, or someone cracking their knuckles repeatedly. It kept making these low, muttering noises that sounded like it was trying to form words, but failing. I heard snatches of my own voice mixed in, as if it was replaying random fragments of what I'd said earlier. Hearing that thing try to imitate me was beyond unsettling. I tried not to scream, but I was breathing so hard that I thought I might pass out. I knew I had to get out of there, so I ran. I didn't care about twisting my ankle anymore. I just needed to put distance between me and that thing. I crashed through the brush, jumped over those weirdly arranged logs, and tried to remember the way back. All the while, I could hear it behind me. It never seemed to break into a full run, but I could sense it back there, following, making those disgusting clicking noises and occasionally whispering something in that distorted version of my own voice. The smell followed me too, that awful, metallic, bloody stench. I was convinced I wasn't going to make it out. At some point, I broke through the thicker part of the forest and spotted the paved road that led back toward the ranger's station. I could have cried with relief. Just as I approached the edge of the tree line, I heard the thing let out this frustrated grunt, then a piercing, high-pitched whistle-like sound. It was so loud it hurt my ears. And then, just like that, the noises stopped. I stumbled out onto the road, almost losing my footing. I saw headlights approaching, one of the park's vehicles, likely a ranger making late rounds. I flagged him down, trying to look composed, but I was shaking all over and probably looked like I'd seen a ghost. The ranger rolled down the window and asked if I was okay. I just told him I'd seen something large and aggressive in the woods. I must have sounded insane, but I didn't dare mention what I really saw. He gave me a weird look, but then he just pointed me in the right direction to get back to the outpost. I didn't say much else. I just wanted to leave. That night, back in my motel room, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was dehydrated, or maybe I'd gotten turned around and panicked when the sun went down. But I knew what I heard and what I saw. Later, I came across stories online about creatures that mimic voices and appear as twisted, deer-like beings, some sort of skinwalkers or shapeshifters from native legends. I don't know what I believe, but I know something was out there that day. I still get chills thinking about it. I've never had an experience like that since, and I've never gone that deep into unknown territory alone again. I can't explain it, and I'm not sure I want to try. All I know is that something in those woods tried to mess with me, tried to scare me, and it succeeded. It appeared, it terrified me, and then it vanished as if it had never been there, and I have no idea why. To this day, I can't make sense of any of it.